Chapter 36, Daniel versus Vindictus. The doors did appear together, as Daniel had predicted. Thankfully, the corridor on which the new door stood was largely intact, though the first signs of familiar cracks were creeping into the polished slabs. The doors were identical, arched and shining black with a gold doorknob. The only difference between the two was the nameplates, each displaying the name of the challenger. As Daniel placed the Book of Wonders on the floor between the two doors, he sensed suddenly that the corridor was filled with people. He straightened up, looked around, and his eyes widened. The Emporium staff, at least those who were able, had come. They stood side by side, shoulder to shoulder, a ragtag band of misfits, some dabbing black ink from their leaking noses or leaning on their neighbours. Leading the pack, standing tall, was Caleb. He nodded to Daniel. "Come on, Daniel," he yelled to a smattering of cheers. "Show him who's boss," and someone else at the back of the crowd. "We believe in you." Daniel looked at Sharp, and suddenly his opponent did not seem quite so huge, or his task so impossible. He nodded to the crowd, his friends more thankful to have them with him than he could say. Then he said to Vindictus, "Sharp, ready?" Sharp unfolded his arms and did not try to stifle the smug smile that crossed his lips. "Always." They each turned to face the door that contained their challenge. They moved forward and reached for the doorknobs. Then they opened the doors and stepped into the unknown. Daniel was falling. The world around him was black and damp. He landed with a splash in a pool of water so cold that he thought his heart might freeze. Salt water filled his mouth, spurted from his nose as he coughed and choked. Everything was swaying and lurching up and down, turning his stomach. A flash of lightning lit up the world, cast light on a long narrow space with metal walls and bunks and a gallery kitchen. He was in a boat. Realization dawned on Daniel with a sickening lurch of his stomach. His feet barely touching the bottom of the pool. He struggled to a porthole, stared out at the black night. Another fork of lightning. For half a heartbeat, Daniel saw the sea, angry and swollen, waves like mountains crashing all around. He tried to be calm in the pitch black. The water was slowly rising, creeping like cold hands. Feeling his way around, Daniel willed his eyes to see through the blackness. He tried to visualize a lamp, a torch, a floodlight, anything to help him see. He imagined himself striking a match, filling the boat with dancing yellow light, and as the picture filled his head, something dropped into his pocket. He reached down and pulled out a box of sodden matches. Desperately, he struck one of the matches and was amazed when it sparked to life, just as he'd imagined, casting a flickering glow around the tight belly of the boat. He moved out of the galley, banging and stuttering as huge waves tossed the ship to a narrow metal corridor, and found a black door with a golden handle. In his excitement, he dropped his light, but when the match hit the cold surface, the flame did not go out. It remained lit. The match sank as if it was made of lead, illuminating the black water as it drifted towards the floor. He struck another match, the light dazzling his eyes in the dark of the corridor, and he reached for the door. Sharp has underestimated me, he thought, as his hands closed around the handle. But something groaned, loud, metallic and old. There was a ping, and the ship juddered and shook and swung. The sound of rushing water filled Daniel's ears, and he held on tight to whatever his grasping hands could find as the boat began to tip up to fill with water. The floor became steeper and steeper, climbed and climbed until it was vertical, and all the time the doorway bats the Emporium to Ellie and Silver, and his home was being submerged deeper and deeper. Water was spraying everywhere, catching Daniel in the face, filling his mouth and nose. He fell, tumbling, catching his elbow on the metal walls, and landed with a splash in the rising water that would soon fill the entire corridor, the entire ship. Sharp's cruelty shone through, bright as one of Daniel's matches. The idea was simple and brilliant. If Daniel were to escape, he'd have to face his biggest fear and avoid the same death that his father had suffered, alone in the dark with nobody to hold. Sharp's dark door also led to darkness, though the absence of light did not last. Bright lights flickered on all around him, dazzling and familiar, stage lights. The lock on the exit clicked shut. He stood on a grand stage with curtains of black velvet and a floor of polished mahogany. The place seemed vast, though it was difficult to tell. Dazzling lights shone at him from in the theatre, making it impossible to see the audience. But there was an audience there. He could sense it, even if they were oddly silent and still. "This is my challenge?" he asked, flashing perfect teeth. "To perform? To amaze?" He laughed, wondering exactly what it would take to unlock the door. Perhaps some sort of approval from the crowd, since the boy would soon be dead. It hardly mattered, but something about being on the stage again performing appealed to him. He took off his coat and threw it in the air, where it became black smoke and evaporated. He looked to the audience. Silence. Perhaps pleasing this crowd would be more challenging than he thought. He tried again, firing a bullet from a gun and catching it across the stage. The crowd was still. Sharp shook his head and cursed. "What do you people want?" he yelled. Something broke the silence. The voice of a young girl. "Let him see me," the voice said. "For this to work, he has to see me. I'm asking for help, Papa. Please let him know that I exist. No more ghosts, no more hiding. It's time to end this." "Hello?" There was a hint of unease in Sharp's voice. Across the stage towards the door, a girl appeared from nowhere. She had eyes the colour of thunderclouds, eyes he recognised, and a tangle of wild black curls. "Who are you?" he asked. She stood perfectly still, staring through him. "My name is Ellie Silver," she said, "and I'm your granddaughter." The boat was almost full of water. Daniel was freezing and weak from his efforts to swim down and budge the door. Each time he tried, the water was deeper, and so the swim to the bottom of the submerged passageway became more of a struggle. This time, as he came back up, there was barely enough space to keep his head above the surface. He did not cry, as he thought he might when he imagined the moment in his nightmares. He only thought of the Emporium and Ellie and Mr. Silver, how he'd let them all down if he failed. Another deep breath, another long bursting swim through the darkness, and again he could not move the door. He swam back to the surface, banging his head on the metal ceiling. His time was almost up. If I do die here, he thought, at least it would be fighting for something. At least I didn't sit back and do nothing. He thought of his mother and his father, and he wondered what happened when someone died, if he'd see his parents again, or if dying was like flicking a switch, and he'd be gone and forgotten, and that was that. His nose was pressed against the ceiling now. He was gasping for breath, and then as the water closed in around him, he had a thought, a memory, and he heard Mr. Silver's voice as clearly as if he were floating beside him. "If by some curious twist of fate you find yourself in trouble, the Emporium will help you. All you have to do is ask." The water was in his mouth, in his ears, and his eyes. "Help me," he said to the Emporium through a mouthful of freezing water. "Please help me find my way back." One last breath, Daniel felt the water envelope him. He dived because he did not know what else to do. He swam to the door, began one last attempt to open it. His lungs burned. He fought and fought the overwhelming urge to breathe, ignored his body's desperate call for air. He began to fade. And then someone took his hand in the darkness, and another hand was fumbling in his pockets, removing the matches. A flash of blinding light lit up the black, shaking Daniel back to life. Someone grabbed him round the neck, and he found that he was staring into a face that was both familiar and strange, framed by a mane of hair, the same burning orange as his own. The man took Daniel by the wrist and pulled him back towards the door. Then Daniel stared into his eyes, nodded, and began to pull on the door. Daniel's lungs screamed. The pain made his ears ring, and he saw flashes of light in the corners of his vision. But the door was budging. Slowly, surely, it was opening. The man gave Daniel a smile and nodded towards the door. Half in a dream, Daniel nodded back. He reached for the door with hands like lead, and he pulled. The door opened. Daniel was sucked through the doorway like a spider down a plug hole. He landed hard, gasping cool, fresh air into his lungs. Water was flowing down the corridor and away. The book of matches lay beside him, and he kissed them and stowed them in his pocket as the Emporium staff mobbed him. They picked him up and patted him on the back and called his name. Every breath was a welcome gift. He was back in the corridor. He was alive, and he was quite sure that the ghost of his dead father had just saved his life. "What are you talking about?" Sharp sneered, though there was hesitation in his voice. Ellie took one step towards him. "My papa told me that my mum left me on the doorstep of the Emporium in Edinburgh. He said she was a servant who wanted me to have a better life. I think the servant part was true. That's how you treated her, isn't it?" Sharp stayed very still. "You are not real," he said. "This is a trick." "It is," said Ellie. "I'm real, I promise you that, and I know all about you. You're a monster. You're dangerous. Papa has been protecting me from you all this time. He knew you'd take me away, treat me just like you treated her." "Treated who, for pity's sake?" Ellie pointed to the crowd. The lights had been blinding. Sharp flickered out. He took a sharp breath and a half step back. There were 1,000 seats in the theatre, and every one was taken by the same person. A young woman with red curls and porcelain skin, wearing a white nightgown dyed red with blood from the knife that was sticking in her heart. "Michelle?" whispered Sharp. His face was unreadable, but his voice shook. You treated her like dirt, said Ellie. She was my mum, and you used her to break my papa's heart and steal his book. She hid away from you while you travelled and made your fortune, and she didn't tell you about me, because in the end, she wasn't like you. There was good in her. What do you want me to say? Said Sharp. Ellie returned the cold stare. Say you're sorry and mean it. That's all you have to do to open the door to win. Silence. Sharp stood centre stage, just the way he liked it. He smiled. I don't have to do a damn thing, he said. He motioned to the door. Out there, through a door just like this one, Daniel Holmes is dying. When his body goes limp and his last breath is gone, this door will unlock and the Book of Wonders will be mine. No sooner had he finished speaking when the lock on the door clicked and the door swung open. Sharp's coat appeared in his hands and he pulled it on and gave Ellie a cruel smile. You see, he said, it was only a matter of how long Mr. Holmes could hold his breath. Actually, I'm quite good at holding my breath. Daniel was sodden. He stood at the door, the Book of Wonders in his hands. The smug look on Sharp's face vanished. Impossible, he said. Daniel raised a finger in correction. You're in the Nowhere Emporium, Mr. Sharp. Nothing is impossible. He held up the book. You lose. The book stays here where it belongs. Sharp stared at Daniel, wild fury in his eyes. But there was no way out. How did you escape? Daniel patted the doorway. I know things you don't, he said, ignoring Sharp when he scoffed. I know that you and Mr. Silver had a challenge of your own. I know that challenge never ended. Don't you see? We're part of it, Ellie and me, players in the same game. This was a challenge within a challenge. We were fighting for Mr. Silver. So here's how it is. Everything we agreed stands. You have to go and never come back. But everything you agreed with Mr. Silver all those years ago also stands. You have to stop stealing life from innocent people, stealing their time, their tomorrows. You have to grow old, and one day you have to die. Sharp spat on the stage floor, his face flushed brilliant red. Where is he hiding? Daniel smiled. He held up the Book of Wonders. In the book, he told you once that the book was part of him, part of his soul. You had the book in your hands, Sharp. You had Silver in your hands, and you never knew. If you hadn't been so arrogant. Sharp moved so quickly, a blur in the shadows. Ellie screamed. Sharp was behind her, holding her tight, a knife to her throat. Behind Daniel, the crowd gasped. You've taken something from me today, Daniel Holmes, and nobody takes anything from me, so I intend to take something from you. The girl is my blood. She will come with me. Step aside, or I'll slit her throat. Daniel shook his head. You don't understand, do you? The Emporium wants you to leave. I'd listen to it if I were you. Out in the theatre audience, the many versions of Michelle Sharp left their seats and began to lumber towards the stage. They climbed the steps, the slow walk of the dead, and formed a ring around Sharp. Stop this, he yelled. Stop it, I'll kill her. Cold hands wrapped around his wrist, prized the dagger from his grip. Ellie aimed a kick at his shins, squirmed free and wriggled through the crowd to Daniel. You took your time, she said. Can we finish this now? Then they turned to Sharp, who was fighting through the crowd towards the door. I may have lost, he yelled, battling away one of the many Michelles, but nowhere in our agreement did it state that I have to leave you in one piece. He reached into his coat, and his blade gleamed in the stage lights. The first two daggers missed their target, plunging deep into the wall beside the door, level with Daniel's head. But Sharp's third throw was true, and the knife spun through the dark theatre towards Daniel's heart. A flash of silver, a chattering call, and the magpie swooped down in front of him. Wings spread wide, the dagger hit the bird in the chest, and the magpie exploded in a cloud of rubies, raining to the ground with a sound like falling stars. Sharp let out a roar of anger. He ran towards Daniel, knocking many versions of his dead daughter out of his path, his teeth clenched, veins popping in his forehead and neck. Daniel opened the book. He tried to stay calm as he found the correct page, and he ripped it out. At once, the floor of the theatre began to break, to crumble, and fall to infinite darkness. The fury in Sharp's face had been replaced by cold fear. He quickened his pace, leaping as sections of the floor disappeared beneath him. The Emporium's glittering bricks closed in around the door, suffocating the doorway. One final roar, and he leapt for the exit. But he fell short and tumbled into the abyss as the door disappeared, sealing him in a nightmare forever. The Emporium was silent. Then the staff roared, and Daniel and Ellie were surrounded by cheering people wanting to hug them, to lift them, and carry them on their shoulders. Give them space, cried Caleb. They haven't finished yet. Daniel scrunched up the page. He handed it to Ellie, took the matches from his pocket and lit one of them. Ellie held the page to the orange flame. They watched and burnt it together until all that remained was a pile of ash. Chapter 37, Pages in the Wind. The front of the shop was still and silent. Everything about the place, from the teetering columns of books to the wondrous array of shimmering treasures and the warmth of the fire, remained unchanged from the very first time Daniel had stumbled through the doors. He placed the Book of Wonders on Silver's desk beside Sharp's empty whiskey bottle. The air in the emporium seemed to become heavy, like the air before a storm. The Book of Wonders trembled. The cover cracked open, slamming on the wooden desk. Pages flicked and fanned. A whistle sounded, the high-pitched shriek of a boiling kettle, and the book leapt into the air. A slap, it landed on the desk and lay still, open at the scorched pages. Words began to form on the burned paper, tiny black ink letters scrawling across the page. And then the words broke free at a page and floated upwards. They blended together, loops and flourishes of ink forming feathered tendrils that shifted and twined in the air like smoke. Details formed. The flash of a hand, what might be an eye. Slowly, surely, the words took the shape of a man wearing a dusty grey suit, a man with thundercloud eyes and a head full of wild, tangled brown hair, a living, breathing, solid person. Mr. Silver blinked. He rubbed a hand across his forehead and shook the cobwebs from his brain. He looked much older than Daniel remembered. "Well," he said, "that stung more than I imagined." Ellie leapt on him, knocking a cloud of dust from his suit. "Papa! Oh, Papa! Papa!" Silver held her tightly. He placed his hands upon his daughter's face, wiped away her tears with his thumbs, and looked into her eyes, a mirror of his own. "I'm so very sorry that I left you. I promised there was no other way." He glanced at Daniel and said, "But you know what? You know that, don't you? You know everything." Daniel said, "Sharp told me that after such a long time the emporium was becoming too much for you." Mr. Silver smiled, and his eyes were sad. "It began 5 or 6 years ago. At first I barely noticed, but as time dragged on I began to feel the strain, to feel my grip on the emporium loosening. I knew that my powers were fading, and each time we moved on I felt Vindictus Sharp edge closer. There were a few very close calls. He almost caught up with us in Barcelona." "And that's why you needed the unicorn blood, isn't it?" said Daniel. "Initially, I intended to use it to prolong my life, just enough to find a suitable replacement. But things moved too quickly. I was forced to act." Daniel said, "I invited Sharp into the emporium, Mr. Silver. None of this would have happened if I hadn't—" "I'm sorry." Silver held up a hand. "You, my boy, have nothing to be sorry about. Sharp would have found a way in eventually. He'd been watching us. He tricked his way into Ellie's birthday ball, and that's when I made the decision to go into hiding. Sharp had remained strong by stealing other people's futures. In my weakened state, I would have been no match for him. He would have taken the book, and the emporium would have been lost. I used the unicorn blood and almost every drop of my remaining magical strength to place myself in the book. But I did not abandon you. Despite how it might have seemed, I retained a link to the outside world. Something small, something that wouldn't take too much effort to sustain. The magpies." "You were the magpies?" Daniel said. "Always," said Silver. "They were my eyes and ears. I realised as things unfolded that I would have to lead you to the truth about Sharp, a terrible truth, a truth I would rather remain buried." Mr. Silver looked at the floor, and then he seemed to Daniel to become a small boy waiting to be scolded. Ellie said, "It's true, we saw everything. We saw what happened on the night you went to get the book back from Sharp, but it wasn't your fault. You didn't kill her." Silver looked up and there were tears in his grey eyes. "For over 100 years I have been running from the past," he said. "It's a relief that you finally know the truth. I wish I could go back, Ellie, and change what happened." "You can," said Ellie. "You can do anything. Go back and stop Sharp before he throws the knife. Kill him before he kills you." Silver looked almost tortured then. "I'm not a monster, Ellie, and you know that's not how it works. If I change the past, I change the present. We'll all be different people, shaped by different experiences. We won't exist as we do now, and I do not wish to lose the you that I know." Ellie dabbed at her eyes with a knuckle. "Michelle was really my mum, and she just left me on the doorstep like a bag of rubbish." "Your mother was not a bad woman," said Silver with a shake of his head. "She was manipulated by a master, but she knew when you were born that she had to give you up. She didn't wish you to be treated as she had been, or worse, for you to be taken away from her and raised by Sharp. So she brought you here. It was quite a surprise to find you on the doorstep, and Sharp has always been the reason that I have insisted you cannot leave. It's not because I'm lonely. It's not because I don't love you. I love you most of all, Ellie, more than you can imagine. You are the one thing in this world that I have got right. As long as you remain inside the emporium, I can ensure that Sharp couldn't harm you, couldn't even see you. You have always been safe." Not if the Emporium falls apart around me, said Ellie. Silver scratched his head. I would never have put you in danger like that. It was all in my note. He stopped. Ah, yes, the note. Didn't quite work out as I'd hoped. Ellie reached into her pocket. Oh, you mean this note? She waved the scrap of paper. The note that tells us absolutely nothing? Silver stared at it. Yes, he said, plucking the note from Ellie's hand and sniffing the burned edges. Got scorched along with the book. Bit of a mistake. My plan was quite similar to Daniel's, as it turns out, and part of the note said that you are now free to leave the Emporium any time you wish. He smiled and nodded towards the door. There's nothing to hide from now. The world is yours. Ellie's eyes bugged open. She looked at the door. A familiar rumble came from behind the curtain. The shop shivered and the flames in the fire dulled and hiccuped. Mr. Silver staggered backwards and then regained his footing and charged to his desk, picking up the book. We don't have much time. If the Emporium is to be saved, then it must be passed to someone else, someone who's up to the challenge. He patted the battered cover. When I first began my search for a successor, I never imagined that the book would choose someone so young. His hand rested on Daniel's shoulder. What do you say, Daniel Holmes? The question was too huge to fit entirely into Daniel's head. It took him a long time to answer. Me? Take over the Emporium? I'm just a boy. I don't know how. You are old and wise enough to defeat an ancient and dangerous man, and you will not be alone. Another rumble. Silver folded into his seat, clutching at his chest. If I say no, said Daniel, the Emporium will die. It's not fair. It's not a fair thing to ask someone. Mr. Silver said, everything has its season, Daniel. If today is the day that the Emporium passes into history, then it will certainly not be your fault. The blame for all this lies with me. Daniel's mind was bursting with questions, with ideas, fears, and excitement. I don't think I could do what you've done, live like you've lived, he said. I don't want to steal anyone's imagination. Mr. Silver held up his hand. You won't need to. If anyone has the imagination to power the Emporium, it is you, my dear boy. I would never demand that you live with the mistakes I have made. And if I have made many, it will be a clean slate, a blank page. Your Emporium, your rules, your life. I could be normal, said Daniel. I could grow up and grow old and pass the Emporium on to someone else when I think it's time. Silver smiled. I think that would be a very wise way to live. Daniel's gaze found Ellie. He wondered what was going on in her head, how she felt about her father passing the torch to someone other than herself. And then, as though reading his thoughts, she gave him a smile, showing the gap between her front teeth, and a nod. Mr. Silver offered a hand. Do we have a bargain? Will the staff be okay? Caleb and Anya and the others? The ones who survive will stay with you, said Silver. He rubbed his eyes, but I'm afraid to say there is no bringing back those who perished. They came from my mind, my imagination. You will have to write some new staff. Daniel thought about the vastness of the Emporium. The shop was many things. It was a magical place, a place where anything was possible, a place with the power to bring happiness to the hearts of those who visited, those who believed. But to Daniel, most of all, it was home. The Emporium was where he belonged, at last. He shook Silver's hand. As their fingers touched, Daniel felt a shiver run up his spine. Something seemed to wrap around him like an invisible blanket, and then it was gone, and their hands came apart. The air between them cracked. Mr. Silver handed Daniel the Book of Wonders, and as Daniel held it, the cracked and worn cover began to repair until the leather was smooth and shining. The golden letters shone clear once more. Only this time, the name on the cover was not Mr. Silver's. Daniel stared at the inscription. The Wonders of Daniel Holmes. It's done, said Mr. Silver. Right, I'm not going to read on anymore. I'm going to leave you to pause because the video is getting very long. You can pause on the page and read the rest yourselves. So if you pause now to read the rest of this page. Pause again. And finally, pause again. Okay.